The hum of the engines was nothing compared to the tension that grew inside the cabin, because what began as a routine flight would soon unravel into a confrontation that no one on board could forget. A single act of arrogance, a sharp insult hurled toward a black passenger who carried herself with quiet grace, ignited a chain of moments that stripped the air of comfort and left everyone watching in uneasy silence. She sat there composed, her face unreadable, yet behind her calm was a fire forged by years of being measured, dismissed, and diminished by strangers who believed skin alone could define worth. Passengers whispered, some amused, some uncomfortable, but none could predict the truth about the woman in that seat, nor imagine that the target of mockery would hold the kind of power that could bring an entire corporation to its knees. The humiliation that played out in that cramped aisle was only the surface of a story that would soon shatter reputations, end careers, and force the world to confront what dignity really means. This is not just about a flight, it is about a reckoning, one born in silence, but destined to echo far beyond the cabin walls. If you want to follow this story as it twists and builds toward its revelation, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments what strikes you most and where you are watching from, because your voice matters in keeping these truths alive. On a crowded flight preparing for departure from Atlanta, the cabin was alive with the restless energy of travelers settling into their seats, attendants conducting their final checks, and the low rumble of engines vibrating through the fuselage. Among the passengers taking their places was a poised black woman dressed in a simple blazer, her demeanor calm yet commanding in its quiet strength. She slid gracefully into seat 2A, first class, setting her tablet on her lap as if she had done this routine countless times before. Her name was Dr. Alicia Grant, but in that moment she was just another traveler in the eyes of those who glanced at her. The difference was that their glances carried skepticism, doubt, even disdain. Some passengers looked on with curiosity, but others whispered under their breath as if her presence in first class disrupted an unspoken expectation. The tension crystallized when a tall flight attendant, Claire Donovan, stopped by Alicia's seat. Claire's posture radiated authority, but her expression was sharp, almost hostile. Her voice rang through the cabin, slicing through the background chatter like a blade. "Excuse me, girl," she said with open contempt. "This isn't the welfare line. First class is for people who can actually afford it." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin. Several passengers froze mid-conversation, while others leaned closer to watch the confrontation unfold. The insult hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Alicia slowly raised her eyes to meet Claire's, her expression steady and composed. Without breaking her calm, she reached into her blazer and retrieved her boarding pass. "I have a first-class ticket," she replied softly, her voice so measured it only amplified the contrast to Claire's sharp hostility. Claire snatched the boarding pass from her fingers with exaggerated suspicion, lifting it toward the light as though expecting to uncover a forgery. After a theatrical pause, she slapped it back against Alicia's chest with deliberate force. The sound reverberated like a slap of flesh, sharp enough to draw collective gasps from nearby passengers. "Don't try to scam your way up here, honey," Claire sneered, her tone dripping with disdain. Few passengers chuckled under their breath, hiding their smirks behind raised hands. The elderly woman seated in 1D leaned closer to her husband and whispered in a voice loud enough for others to catch, "They always try this nonsense." In seat 1C, a businessman with his phone already in hand angled the camera toward Alicia, whispering for his online followers, "This is what entitlement looks like, trying to sit in first class without paying for it." Alicia adjusted her blazer casually, the polished steel of her watch catching the light. She made no effort to argue or defend herself. Her silence was deliberate, the kind of silence that drew more attention than shouting ever could. She had been underestimated before, countless times in countless rooms, and she had learned that anger only gave power away. Composure was her weapon. Claire, however, wasn't content to let the moment rest. She pulled out her own phone and flipped it to selfie mode, her smirk growing wider. "Hey everyone," she announced, her voice carrying to the back of the cabin. "It's your girl Claire, dealing with some drama here in first class. This woman thinks she can just sit wherever she wants." The passengers in first class, still murmuring and whispering, leaned into the unfolding scene as though it were a performance staged for their entertainment. Dr. Alicia Grant remained perfectly composed in her seat, her phone resting quietly in her hand, her posture unyielding in its calm. The uniformed officer in front, Daniel Ruiz, stepped into the cabin first, his broad frame casting a shadow over the aisle. Without so much as a glance at the boarding pass still on Alicia's tray, he looked directly to Claire for an explanation. "What's the situation here?" he asked in a clipped tone. Claire wasted no time in exaggerating. "This passenger is in the wrong seat, refusing to move to coach where she belongs," she said loudly enough for the surrounding rows to hear. She gestured toward Alicia as though pointing out contraband. Ruiz nodded, already half convinced before addressing the woman in 2A. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to gather your things and step off the aircraft so we can resolve this properly." Alicia lifted her eyes to him slowly, her expression still calm but laced with an unspoken authority. "I am seated in the place my ticket designates," she replied softly, her voice even but firm. "I will not move until proper verification is made by the captain." Ruiz frowned at the firmness in her voice, unused to passengers resisting his directives with such composure. Claire interjected eagerly, angling her phone to capture the exchange. "You see? She's refusing direct orders from security," she declared, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. "She thinks she can just sit wherever she pleases." The elderly woman in 1D turned in her seat, her voice filled with smug certainty. "Honey, it's obvious she's trying to scam her way up here. We've all seen it before." Her husband nodded in agreement, fueling the prejudice that rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 1C, still recording for his online followers, whispered gleefully into his camera, "Folks, this is entitlement at its finest. She won't even move when security tells her to. Hashtag first-class fraud. Get this trending." His stream was already being shared across aviation forums, the comments piling up with insults, mockery, and worse. Alicia kept her eyes steady on Ruiz, unmoving, a calm figure amidst the rising storm. Her silence infuriated Claire, who leaned down closer, lowering her voice for dramatic effect, but still broadcasting into her live stream. "Girl, the captain doesn't have time for your games. Just grab your bag and head to coach before this gets ugly." The young Latina woman in 3B squirmed in her seat, her hands clenched tightly together. She had seen the boarding pass when Alicia first entered the cabin, had noted the clear lettering that read to A, first class, but the weight of the moment and the fear of standing out kept her silent. Her eyes darted nervously between Alicia and the flight crew, guilt pressing at her chest, but her voice locked away. Behind her, a middle-aged black man in 4C finally stood halfway up from his seat. "Excuse me," he said clearly, his voice carrying in the hushed cabin. "This doesn't seem right. The lady has her boarding pass. I saw it myself when she boarded." His words broke through the whispers, bringing a sudden wave of attention his way. Officer Ruiz fixed him with a hard stare. "Sir, please remain seated," he barked, his tone sharp with the authority of someone who expected immediate obedience. "Interfering will result in removal." The man hesitated, then sat back down reluctantly, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. Claire smirked, her eyes flicking back to her phone, her live stream audience lighting up with approval. The comments flew across the screen. "Drag her off already. Entitlement at its worst. Why do they always play victim?" Ruiz pressed his radio to his mouth, speaking into it with brisk efficiency. "Ground control, possible passenger removal at gate 12A. Stand by for gate return clearance." His words carried finality, as though the decision had already been made. Alicia tapped her phone once more, sending a brief update to her assistant and legal team, her movements precise, deliberate, not the frantic tapping of someone panicking, but the calm preparation of someone always 3 steps ahead. Around her, the passengers grew restless. Some muttered for the situation to end quickly. Others leaned forward eagerly, hungry for drama. A businessman in 3A pulled out his own phone to record, muttering under his breath, "This is going to be news by tomorrow." The elderly woman in 1D clapped her hands softly, her smug satisfaction clear. Heavy footsteps again echoed at the aircraft door, but this time the presence carried a different weight. A man in a pressed uniform with a clipboard in hand entered, his expression one of immediate authority that surpassed even Ruiz's. He was the senior flight manager, Robert Harlan, and the crew straightened instinctively at his arrival. Claire quickly minimized her live stream on the screen, but kept it running quietly in the background, confident that she was minutes away from vindication. Robert scanned the cabin with sharp eyes, taking in the scene, the scattered phones recording, the passengers leaning forward in expectation, and finally, the composed figure of Alicia seated in 2A. "What's the delay?" he demanded, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone used to being obeyed. Claire answered immediately, shifting her tone from hostile to professional as though flicking a switch. "Passenger in the wrong seat, sir," she said, gesturing at Alicia. Refusing to move to coach, Robert turned his gaze on Alicia, his brow furrowing slightly at her calm posture, the elegance of her blazer, the quality of the handbag on her lap. Something in his eyes flickered, not recognition but calculation, as if her presence disrupted the simple narrative he had been told. "Ma'am," he said, extending his hand. "May I see your boarding pass and identification?" Alicia finally smiled faintly for the first time since the ordeal began. "Of course," she said evenly, handing over her documents with deliberate precision. Robert examined the boarding pass carefully. It read Seat 2A, purchased 3 days ago at a cost of $2,847. The ID confirmed her name as Dr. Alicia Grant, her address listed in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Atlanta. His eyes narrowed. He had worked for airlines for over 15 years, and he had seen sophisticated scams before. Wealthy appearances could be manufactured, forgeries could be convincing, and even confident mannerisms could be rehearsed. He decided to lean into suspicion. "These documents appear legitimate," he said slowly, "but we've had issues with high-quality forgeries recently. I'll need to verify through our central system." Claire's lips curled into a smirk, glancing down at her phone as she whispered for her audience. "She thinks she's smart." But even the manager's not buying it. The businessman in 1C nodded approvingly, whispering to his viewers, "Exactly, she's stalling. Just remove her already." The elderly woman in 1D gave a satisfied smile, whispering, "See, I told you she was lying," while patting her husband's hand. Robert pulled a tablet from under his clipboard, scrolling through the airline's passenger database. Alicia's name appeared in the system with a gold status account, but her flight history was limited, not what he expected from someone dressed with such understated wealth. His suspicion grew, though it was more instinct than evidence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice adopting the practiced tone of someone who had played this role many times before, "our records indicate some irregularities with your booking. Did you purchase this ticket directly or through a third-party vendor?" Alicia looked at him with measured calm, her hand resting lightly on the phone in front of her. "Directly through your website," she said. "Would you like the confirmation number?" Her voice carried no tremor, no defensiveness, only a quiet precision that made several passengers glance at one another, confused by her confidence. The young Latina woman in 3B suddenly raised her voice, her cheeks flushed. Claire Donovan still had her phone tilted discreetly to her side, her live stream continuing silently as she basked in her sense of victory. The businessman in 1C was nearly breathless with anticipation, whispering to his viewers that they were about to see justice served. The elderly woman in 1D sat forward with smug satisfaction, as though decades of her own biases were about to be confirmed in one humiliating scene. But Alicia Grant, still seated firmly in 2A, showed no signs of panic, fear, or anger. Instead, she drew in a slow, deliberate breath, reached for the small black leather case resting in her blazer pocket, and placed it carefully on her tray table. Her fingers lingered lightly on the cover, as though controlling the exact pace of the moment, as though she had choreographed this from the beginning. "Mr. Harlan," she said evenly, her voice low yet carrying across the hushed cabin, "before you make any irreversible decisions, I suggest you call the captain to the cabin personally." Her words, calm and controlled, hung in the air like a challenge no one expected. Robert's brows drew together in irritation, his pride and authority stung by her refusal to comply. "Ma'am, I have full authority here. The captain has delegated passenger matters to me. There is no need to escalate this further." Alicia's gaze did not waver. Her fingers tapped gently against the leather case, the motion so controlled it radiated confidence. "Some decisions require the captain's direct attention," she replied with a softness that somehow carried more force than shouting ever could. Claire rolled her eyes dramatically for her audience, her whisper biting as she leaned into her phone. She's stalling, probably trying to think of another lie. This is pathetic. Her live stream comments lit up in real time, viewers demanding that security drag Alicia off, others taunting her appearance, some mocking the way she sat there with unshakable calm. The businessman in 1C muttered again into his phone's camera, "She's bluffing. It's just some fake business card she printed out at home." Ruiz shifted uneasily, not because he believed Alicia, but because her composure unsettled him. In 15 years of dealing with unruly passengers, he had never encountered one who seemed so certain, so unflinching in the face of authority. He pressed his radio once more. "Ground control, request update on gate return for passenger removal." The young Latina woman in 3B watched Alicia's hand resting on the case, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. Something about the woman in 2A felt different, something in her bearing, her quiet certainty, the way she controlled the room even while being surrounded by hostility. The black man in 4C leaned forward slightly, whispering to her, "You see that? She's not bluffing." Alicia finally opened the leather case and slid out a single card. She did not reveal it immediately. Instead, she placed it face down on her tray table, her fingertips resting lightly on top as though the weight of her hand alone guarded something powerful. "Officer Ruiz," she said evenly, her eyes meeting his, "I appreciate your professionalism, but I recommend you wait for the captain's assessment before proceeding further." Ruiz hesitated, his eyes flicking from the card to Robert, uncertain of his next move. Robert scoffed, his frustration growing. "Ma'am, we don't play games here. If you think a piece of cardboard is going to change the fact that you refuse to follow crew instructions, you're mistaken." Alicia leaned back slightly, her expression calm, her silence deliberate. It was the silence of someone who knew her position did not need defending, only revealing. Claire, sensing her victory slipping, hissed sharply into her phone for her live viewers. "She's acting like she's somebody. Watch, this card will be nothing." But the murmurs in the cabin shifted, no longer fully on her side. Several passengers whispered to one another, questioning whether Alicia knew something the rest of them did not. The businessman in 3A leaned into his recording, muttering, "This is getting interesting. She doesn't look like she's bluffing." Robert exhaled sharply, his patience thinning under the pressure of passengers, security, and now this quiet defiance. He reached for his radio again, but before he could speak, a voice boomed through the intercom. "This is Captain Alvarez. Flight crew, pause all departure preparations until I receive a status update on the passenger issue in first class." The cabin jolted as though struck by a sudden current. Robert's eyes flicked up, irritation quickly replaced by unease. He had not yet informed the captain of specific seat details, only that there was an issue. Robert Harlan froze, the clipboard in his hand trembling slightly. His previous confidence drained as he realized the captain's reaction did not align with the narrative he had been clinging to. Claire Donovan's hand shook as she adjusted her phone, her live stream still running though her smile had disappeared entirely. Her audience now flooding her screen with frantic questions about why the captain seemed to treat this particular passenger so differently. Dr. Alicia Grant remained still, her posture unchanged, her calm eyes locked with the captain's, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. Captain Alvarez walked forward slowly, his gaze locked on the card in her hand, his face transforming with each step until recognition settled in fully. His voice, no longer stern but carefully respectful, broke the silence. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." Gasps rippled through the cabin. passengers shifting in their seats as confusion and curiosity replaced some of the smugness that had hung in the air. The businessman in 1C, still recording with his phone, leaned closer to his camera and whispered breathlessly, "What is happening?" The captain looks terrified. Alicia placed a card face up on her tray table, turning it so the letters were visible to the rows nearest her. The young Latina woman in 3B leaned forward instinctively, her eyes scanning the text before widening in shock. She covered her mouth with both hands and whispered to the black man in 4C, "Oh my God." He leaned forward, squinting until he too caught sight of the name embossed in gold. His mouth opened slightly, his earlier doubts replaced with astonishment. Claire Donovan caught the exchange and snapped irritably into her phone, "Don't believe their act. Anyone can make a fake card." Though her voice lacked the venom of certainty it had carried earlier. Her viewers, however, were less forgiving. Comments scrolled rapidly. "Why does the captain look scared? What does the card say? She's someone important, isn't she?" Alicia lifted the card with a calm grace, holding it up so the first 3 rows could clearly see. The businessman in 1C leaned forward further, his phone zooming in as his voice faltered while reading aloud for his stream. Washington Aerospace Industries. Dr. Alicia Grant, Chief Executive Officer and Founder. His voice trailed off, the implications crashing into him mid-sentence. The reaction in the cabin was immediate. Murmurs exploded as passengers began to realize who had been seated in 2A all along. Washington Aerospace was not just a name, it was a titan in the aviation industry, a company that leased aircraft to airlines across North America. It was a company that controlled billions in assets, a company that often determined whether an airline thrived or failed. The businessman's stream erupted with disbelief, his followers commenting frantically, "Wait, she OWNS the planes. This is real. That flight attendant just humiliated the CEO of a company that controls her job." Claire's face turned pale, the confidence draining from her as the reality began to sink in. She had not just mocked a passenger. She had not just accused someone of fraud. She had humiliated, slapped, and live-streamed the CEO of the company that owned the very aircraft she worked on. Robert's clipboard slipped slightly in his grip as sweat formed on his brow. "Ma'am, I didn't realize," he began, but his words faltered under the weight of Alicia's steady gaze. Alicia leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but carrying the resonance of truth that cut through every excuse, every prejudice that had filled the cabin. "You didn't realize because you didn't want to," she said softly. "You assumed, you accused, and you created a spectacle." Robert Harlan's confidence crumbled into silence, his clipboard now a useless prop in hands slick with sweat. Officer Daniel Ruiz shifted uncomfortably, his practiced authority suddenly feeling misplaced in the presence of a woman who clearly held far greater power than anyone on board had imagined. The businessman in 1C, still recording for his audience, no longer sneered but stammered into his phone. She owns the company that leases this plane. She's not just a passenger, she's the owner." His viewers flooded his stream with disbelief and awe, some demanding verification, while others posted screenshots of Washington Aerospace contracts and news articles surfacing in real time. The cabin, once united in its assumption of Alicia's guilt, now fractured into silence and shock. Alicia, however, remained unchanged in her posture, her calm demeanor the same as it had been from the beginning, but now that calm radiated a different meaning. It was no longer the quiet of endurance, but the authority of a woman who had revealed her true place in the hierarchy. She lifted her phone again, tapped a few times, and displayed another screen for all to see, showing detailed financial contracts tied to Skylink Airlines, listing specific figures and aircraft tail numbers. "This aircraft," she said evenly, her voice carrying across the cabin with measured precision, "is leased under a 7-year renewable agreement. Annual value, $2.3 million. Washington Aerospace controls similar contracts with 3 other major carriers. Skylink Airlines is one of the smallest in our portfolio." Murmurs swept through the cabin again, passengers leaning toward one another, realizing the scale of what had just been revealed. The young Latina woman in 3B, her voice trembling with awe, whispered to the black man in 4C, she's not just rich. She controls the planes they fly. He nodded slowly, shaking his head in amazement. They picked the wrong woman to humiliate today. Claire, pale and trembling now, muttered desperately, "That doesn't mean anything. Anyone can print numbers on a screen. Anyone can." Alicia's voice cut her off, calm but edged with steel. "Ms. Donovan, would you like me to dial the 24-hour verification line for Washington Aerospace? They can confirm my identity and the company's contractual relationship with this aircraft. I am certain they would be happy to speak directly with the captain." Her words carried no trace of anger, only certainty. But that certainty left Claire speechless. Robert finally found his voice, though it cracked as he spoke. "Even if this is true," he stammered, "it doesn't excuse your refusal to cooperate with crew instructions." Alicia turned her gaze on him, her expression unflinching. "Mr. Harlan, what you call refusal was in fact restraint. I complied with all lawful requests. I showed valid documents. Witnesses confirmed the validity of my boarding pass. What I did not comply with was an unlawful attempt to remove me from my rightful seat based on discriminatory assumptions, and the failure of your staff to follow proper verification procedures. That is not refusal. That is protecting my rights." The cabin was silent, every passenger listening intently, recording devices capturing her words. Claire glanced helplessly at Robert, who had no response. Captain Alvarez, standing a few feet away, nodded grimly at Alicia's explanation, understanding fully the scope of the crisis unfolding. "She's right," he said quietly but firmly. "Protocol requires document verification before accusations of fraud are made. That did not happen here." His acknowledgement struck Robert like a blow, his already fragile authority collapsing under the captain's words. The businessman in 3A, still recording, whispered, "She just dismantled them in front of everyone. This is bigger than anything I've ever seen." Alicia tapped her phone again, this time opening a financial tracking app, holding it up for Captain Alvarez to see. "In the last 10 minutes, she said calmly, Washington Aerospace shares have risen by 2.3%. Skylink Airlines parent company shares have fallen by nearly 2%. The market has already reacted to this incident." Alvarez paled, realizing that the impact had already spread far beyond the walls of the cabin. News outlets were likely already monitoring the viral footage, financial analysts already calculating the damage. Alicia leaned back slightly, her composure unbroken. "This is no longer a passenger issue. This is now a corporate issue, a legal issue, and a reputational issue for your airline." Claire's voice cracked as she whispered, "I didn't know who you were." Alicia's gaze turned to her, sharp yet calm. "And you shouldn't have to," she replied. "Respect is not contingent on status or wealth. Every passenger deserves dignity. That is where you failed, Ms. Donovan. You chose to weaponize assumptions, and you broadcast them to the world." Claire's shoulders slumped, her silence louder than her earlier arrogance. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some guilty for their own silence, others ashamed for their laughter and agreement with Claire's earlier comments. The elderly woman in 1D stared down at her hands, her earlier smugness now replaced with visible regret. The businessman in 1C, his live stream still running, said softly into his phone, "This is going to be the most expensive discrimination case in airline history." Alicia set her phone down on the tray, her gaze sweeping the cabin. "I will not press charges against individual passengers for their silence," she said. "But let us all recognize what silence enables. It emboldens people like Ms. Donovan. It allows injustice to escalate. And it nearly allowed me to be removed from my rightful seat on an aircraft owned by my company." Her words, calm yet devastating, reverberated through the cabin, forcing every passenger to confront their role in what had happened. Captain Alvarez turned to Robert and spoke firmly. She tilted it toward Captain Alvarez and Robert so they could see the header at the top, Washington Aerospace Industries Standard Lease Agreement. Her voice was quiet, steady, but it carried across the rows with clarity that pierced every corner of the cabin. "Section 47, she read, her tone measured. "Discrimination and hostile environment provisions. Any lessee found to engage in discriminatory practices against protected classes while operating leased aircraft may face immediate contract review and potential termination. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers leaned forward, straining to hear. The businessman in 1C whispered into his phone's camera, his live stream still broadcasting to hundreds. She's citing legal clauses, she's got them cornered. His viewers exploded with reactions, verified attorneys even commenting in real time about the binding nature of such provisions. Robert's throat tightened as he struggled to swallow, the clipboard in his hands nearly slipping from his grip. Claire's face drained of color, her phone trembling in her hands as she tried frantically to delete her live stream, realizing it was now incontrovertible evidence against her. Alicia scrolled further down the document, her eyes scanning swiftly before she read again, her voice unwavering. Section 52. Any crew or employee engaged in defamatory, false accusations regarding passenger documentation will be subject to full liability exposure under contract law. Violations recorded and verified through public documentation or digital capture constitute grounds for accelerated termination of lease. The black man in 4C leaned forward, whispering to the Latina woman in 3B. She's got them by the throat. The young woman nodded, her eyes wide, unable to look away from the screen. Captain Alvarez stared at the contract with growing dread, fully aware that if Washington Aerospace chose to exercise these clauses, Skylink Airlines could be bankrupted within weeks. Alicia closed the document briefly and looked directly at Claire. Her tone was calm, but her words struck with precision. Ms. Donovan, your live stream broadcast this incident to hundreds without my consent. That violates not only company policy, but federal passenger privacy protections. Your actions have created liability not just for yourself, but for your employer. Every word you spoke, every insult, every mocking phrase has been preserved and circulated beyond your control. You have handed my legal team enough material to dismantle your defense before you even utter a word. Claire opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. Her throat tightened as the weight of reality pressed in on her. Passengers around her stared, some shaking their heads in disbelief that she had been so careless, others quietly pleased to see her arrogance unravel. Alicia turned next to Robert. Mr. Harlan, your failure to follow protocol has compounded the liability. You dismissed valid documents, ignored witness testimony, and escalated the situation without verification. Not only did you fail as a manager, but you created the appearance of collusion with discriminatory conduct. In 15 minutes, your decisions have exposed your airline to reputational, legal, and financial risk that cannot be undone. Robert's lips trembled, his voice breaking as he tried to defend himself. Dr. Grant, I was only following procedure. Alicia's eyes narrowed slightly. No, Mr. Harlan, you were following prejudice. The procedure is clear. Verification first. Accusation never. You reversed both, and you did it in front of witnesses, cameras, and a live audience. The elderly woman in 1D lowered her gaze to her lap. Her earlier smugness burned away by the realization that she too had participated in the public shaming of someone who had every right to be in her seat. Alicia's words were no longer just directed at the crew, but at every silent accomplice who had watched and chosen not to act. She turned back to her phone, this time opening a different app, one that displayed real-time analytics of social media activity. She tilted the screen for the captain and Robert to see. Within the last 20 minutes, this incident has been viewed more than 2,000 times across platforms. The hashtag Skylink discrimination is now trending in Atlanta, Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. Aviation industry professionals, civil rights attorneys, and financial analysts are sharing this story in real time. Your company's reputation is unraveling at this very moment. Captain Alvarez inhaled sharply, recognizing that the damage had already spilled far beyond the cabin. He reached for his radio with shaking hands. This is Captain Alvarez, requesting immediate patch through to Regional Director Morrison. Code red passenger escalation. While waiting for the connection, Alicia leaned back slightly, her calm never breaking. The businessman in 1C whispered into his phone for his viewers. This is nuclear. She's already got management on the hook. This is the end of Skylink if they don't fix this. His chat scrolled so fast he couldn't keep up, viewers speculating on lawsuits, contracts, and potential corporate collapse. The cabin had transformed into an audience for Alicia's deliberate dismantling of systemic discrimination. Finally, the radio crackled, and a voice came through. "Director Morrison here. What's the situation?" Captain Alvarez spoke quickly, his tone stripped of his usual authority. "Sir, we have a passenger discrimination incident involving Dr. Alicia Grant of Washington Aerospace Industries." A long pause filled the cabin, silence so thick it felt tangible. Then Morrison's voice returned, tight with urgency. "Did you say Alicia Grant?" "The Alicia Grant." Alvarez's voice cracked slightly. "Yes, sir. She was subjected to discriminatory treatment by crew and management, and the entire incident was recorded by multiple passengers and streamed live." Morrison's voice grew taut with panic. "How bad is it?" Alicia gestured for the captain to put the call on speaker. "Director Morrison," she said clearly, her tone calm but commanding. "This incident involved false accusations of ticket fraud, suggestions of forged federal documents, and deliberate attempts to remove me from an aircraft leased by my company. All of this occurred on camera, broadcast live, and witnessed by dozens of passengers who have corroborated my evidence." Morrison's inhale was audible even through the static. "Dr. Grant, on behalf of Skylink Airlines, I offer our most profound apology. This is unacceptable and indefensible." Alicia's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not of victory, but of precision. "Director Morrison, apologies do not erase damage. What I require now are corrective actions." The passengers held their breath, realizing they were no longer just watching an argument, but a negotiation of corporate consequence. Alicia outlined her terms with the same measured authority she had displayed since the beginning. Claire Donovan's mouth fell open as if the air had been stolen from her lungs, her face pale and stricken, the reality of termination sinking into her with merciless finality. The phone that had once been her weapon now felt like a smoking gun, its every recorded second an archive of her own downfall. She had mocked, insulted, and live-streamed humiliation, only to realize she had given Alicia the ammunition to destroy her career. Robert Harlan stood frozen, his clipboard hanging limp at his side, his authority shattered, his suspension inevitable. The passengers watched with wide eyes, some ashamed, others astonished, all of them aware that they were witnessing something monumental unfold at 30,000 feet above sea level. Alicia sat calmly in her seat, her breathing steady, her presence commanding without the need for raised volume or harsh tone. She had won the first round decisively, but she was not yet finished. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on the intercom speaker as she continued with the same deliberate control that had dismantled her accusers piece by piece. "Director Morrison, immediate accountability is necessary but insufficient. What I require now is systemic reform. Skylink Airlines must implement unconscious bias training for all customer-facing employees, revise verification procedures to ensure passengers are not profiled, and establish a real-time incident reporting system with executive oversight. Without these changes, your company will continue to create situations like the one I have endured today." Morrison's voice cracked with a strain of controlled panic as he replied, "Dr. Grant, we will commit to those changes immediately. Our legal and HR departments will begin drafting the framework before the day ends." Alicia nodded, the faintest gesture of acknowledgement, but she pressed further. "Additionally, I require quarterly diversity metrics reported directly to Washington Aerospace as part of our ongoing contractual relationship. If those reports reflect further incidents of discrimination, our contracts include provisions for immediate review and termination. You are familiar with those clauses, Director Morrison." Morrison exhaled audibly, the weight of billions in assets pressing down on him. "Yes, Dr. Grant, I am familiar. You will have those reports, and we will comply with every measure you have outlined." Claire shifted on her feet, finally breaking the silence that surrounded her like a shroud. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice brittle, her arrogance clinging desperately to the fragments of her ruined authority. "I was just doing my job. Anyone could have made the same mistake." The cabin turned to her in unison, the passengers' stares heavy with judgment. The captain's expression was one of controlled horror, knowing every word she spoke now only deepened the damage. Alicia's eyes met hers, calm but unyielding. Doing your job does not include making assumptions based on race, creating public spectacles, or violating federal privacy laws by live streaming passengers without consent. Your job was to serve and protect dignity. You failed, and in doing so you jeopardized not only your own career, but the livelihood of your entire company. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. Claire's defiance crumbled, her shoulders slumping, her silence returning, the last remnants of her defense collapsing under Alicia's words. The businessman in 1C, his phone still recording though now in a daze, whispered into a stream. She just buried that flight attendant in front of everyone. This is the end for her. The CEO herself just called her out. His viewers erupted with comments, many of them applauding Alicia, others marveling at the scale of the fallout. Still others remarking that this would soon hit national headlines. The elderly woman in 1D, once the loudest in her agreement with Claire, now sat stiffly, her eyes wet as she finally spoke in a voice quivering with regret. I was wrong. I judged you before I even saw the truth." Alicia turned to her, her voice soft but unwavering. Acknowledgement is the first step toward change. But remember, it should not require revelation of status or power for you to grant basic respect. Dignity must be the default, not the exception. The woman nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, her husband squeezing her hand but saying nothing, his own shame too heavy for words. Captain Alvarez stepped forward then, his silver hair gleaming under the cabin lights, his voice grave with sincerity. "Dr. Grant, on behalf of Skylink Airlines, I apologize personally and professionally. This should never have happened, and I assure you we will follow through on every change you have demanded." Alicia inclined her head slightly, her expression neither forgiving nor vengeful, simply resolute. "See that you do, Captain. Because if you fail, Washington Aerospace will exercise every contractual right we possess, and the consequences will be swift." The cabin stirred with awe at her composure, her power, her relentless precision. Passengers who had doubted her, mocked her, or remained silent now felt the weight of her words pressing against their consciences. The young Latina woman in 3B finally spoke again, her voice stronger than before. "Dr. Grant, I should have said something sooner. I saw your boarding pass. I knew the truth, but I stayed silent because I was afraid. I'm sorry." Alicia's gaze softened slightly as she looked at the young woman. Fear is powerful, but silence is dangerous. What matters is that you speak now. Remember this moment and never let silence shield injustice again. The Latina woman nodded, tears in her eyes, her phone still live streaming quietly to her small but growing audience, her Spanish commentary turning from passive observation to impassioned advocacy. Officer Ruiz, who had remained silent through the storm, stepped closer, his face etched with conflict. "Dr. Grant, I apologize for my part in this. I should have questioned what I was told instead of assuming it was the truth. I acted too quickly." Alicia regarded him steadily. "You acted as you were trained. That is the problem. The system failed you, just as it failed me. That is why it must change. Remember that authority is not the same as justice. Your responsibility is not just to enforce, but to question when enforcement conflicts with fairness." Ruiz nodded slowly, her words settling over him with undeniable clarity. In New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Chicago, strangers in airports huddled around their phones, whispering with shock as they realized a single confrontation at 30,000 feet had detonated into a cultural reckoning. The fallout spread faster than Morrison's crisis team could contain. Skylink's stock plunged 9% within the first hour of trading, investors panicking as Alicia's quiet ultimatum circulated across headlines. Washington Aerospace executive humiliated on Skylink flight, read one, but it was quickly corrected when Alicia's identity became fully known. Dr. Alicia Grant, Aerospace Director, forces airline to confront systemic racism mid-flight. Board members were summoned into emergency meetings, their voices raised, their plans shredded, all of them forced to watch the unstoppable storm of public outrage spiral beyond their control. Meanwhile, in the cabin of Flight 227, Alicia remained calm, her phone silent now, her work for the moment done, but her presence still dominating every nervous glance and hushed whisper. She had not asked for fame or spectacle, yet the world had delivered it to her, placing her at the center of a battle she had prepared her entire life to fight. Passengers began to realize they were no longer just witnesses, but participants in history. The businessman in 1C fielded hundreds of messages from reporters begging for interviews. His shaky video of Alicia dismantling Claire's excuses already being replayed on national television. He looked over at her, awe-replacing greed, and whispered, "You just changed everything." Alicia's eyes flicked to him briefly, her reply calm but firm. "I did what needed to be done. The world will decide what to do with it." In Washington, Morrison's voice trembled as he fielded calls from the Board of Transportation, senators demanding answers, and shareholders threatening lawsuits. He barked orders at his staff, each directive laced with desperation. Get ahead of the narrative. Release the apology now. Suspend every crew member on that flight if necessary. Make Alicia Grant the face of our reform campaign if she'll allow it. Do whatever it takes. But the narrative was already beyond him, fueled not by press releases, but by the millions who had seen with their own eyes the stark difference between cruelty and dignity. Claire, meanwhile, sat alone in the back of the cabin, her uniform disheveled, her eyes hollow, her career shattered. She scrolled through her own phone, watching herself trend not as a professional, but as a symbol of arrogance and bias. Comments poured in, many cruel, others scathing. Her name forever etched into the digital record as the face of what Alicia had dismantled. Robert Harlan's suspension had already been confirmed, his silence only making him appear more complicit, his authority erased. Officer Ruiz stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, wondering how many would now question his badge, his judgment, his role in the spectacle. Alicia glanced toward him, her voice measured but unflinching. "This is not the end. It is only the beginning. Remember what I said. Authority is not justice. Do better next time." He nodded once, the weight of her words burning into his conscience. By the time the plane descended toward D.C., the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed into something reverent, as if the passengers knew they were carrying more than themselves. They were carrying a message. The Latina woman in 3B whispered into her phone, now addressing thousands of live viewers in both English and Spanish. "We watched a woman dismantle systemic racism while still sitting in her seat. Don't let anyone say one person can't change things. She just did." Her viewers erupted in support, the chat filled with tears, prayers, and shouts of solidarity. As the wheels touched the runway, cameras already lined the terminal, reporters jostling for position, news vans blaring their signals across the city. Skylink's CEO, pale and visibly shaken, prepared a statement, her aides handing her draft after draft, none of which could soften the blow that Alicia's voice had already delivered. The moment the doors opened, flashbulbs exploded, microphones thrust forward, and questions crashed through the air like thunder. "Dr. Grant, do you plan to sue?" "Dr. Grant, will Washington Aerospace sever ties with Skylink?" "Dr. Grant, what message do you want to send to the American people?" Alicia stepped forward, her posture unwavering, her voice carrying over the din with the clarity of a leader who had already made peace with her role in history. "This was never about me. This was about the principle that dignity in travel is not optional. It is not conditional. It is absolute. Skylink will face accountability, but more importantly, it will change. And if it doesn't, I will ensure that Washington Aerospace makes sure it does." Her words carried into microphones, through airwaves across oceans. In homes, offices, and airports worldwide, people repeated them, posted them, debated them. But no one could ignore them. This was no longer just a scandal. It was a movement. As Alicia walked past the reporters, her stride unhurried, her presence undeniable, Claire remained behind, shielded by security, her career in ruins, her future uncertain, her name forever tied to the moment she had tried to belittle a passenger she never understood. The passengers followed Alicia out, many of them still shaken, many still replaying her words in their minds. They had boarded a flight expecting nothing more than transit, but they had disembarked as witnesses to the collapse of arrogance and the rise of accountability. She knew that what had erupted on that flight was bigger than her, bigger than Skylink, bigger even than the aerospace industry. It was a mirror reflecting a nation's hidden fractures. She replayed the faces of passengers who had silently nodded in solidarity, of Claire trembling as arrogance collapsed into fear, of Ruiz staring at the floor while truth dismantled his authority. Each face reminded her of the choice people made every day, to stand or to shrink. That night she chose again to stand, but not just for herself. She drafted a statement, not polished, not rehearsed, but true. Dignity is not a privilege, it began. It is the foundation of freedom. If we allow arrogance and prejudice to dictate who is worthy of respect, then freedom itself is a hollow promise. By morning, the statement had reached millions. It was read on morning news programs, shared in classrooms, echoed in churches and community centers, carried like a torch for those who had grown used to being dismissed. Skylink's board offered her settlements, private deals, public accolades, anything to soften the blow, but Alicia refused. She didn't want money, didn't want ceremonial titles, didn't want her name inscribed in plaques, while injustice continued in silence. She wanted change written into policy, into training, into the marrow of every company that touched human lives. Within weeks, federal hearings convened, and Alicia was asked to testify. She sat at the long wooden table under the glare of cameras, her voice steady as she recounted not just the insults of that day, but the pattern that had preceded it. What happened on Flight 227 is not an isolated incident, she told the senators. It is a symptom of something deeper, and until we confront that, passengers will continue to suffer indignities that strip them of their humanity. Her testimony was carried live, millions watching, many with tears in their eyes, as her calm presence pierced through political theater. When she finished, silence filled the chamber, and for once, that silence was not ignorance but respect. Skylink's CEO, visibly shaken, bowed to pressure, announcing sweeping reforms that mandated racial bias training, independent oversight, and strict accountability for misconduct. Claire Donovan, disgraced, disappeared from the industry altogether, her name now a cautionary tale of unchecked arrogance. Officer Ruiz transferred quietly to another post, his silence after the flight replaced with efforts to reform his own department, a small but genuine step forward. Robert Harlan was removed entirely, the weight of his complicity ending his career. But Alicia's message was not about vengeance. It was about transformation. She carried herself not as a victim, but as a vessel of something larger, reminding the nation that justice, when rooted in dignity, does not destroy but rebuilds. Months later, she was invited to speak at a university graduation. Standing at the podium before thousands of young faces, she told them the truth of what had unfolded. "Do not let the world convince you that silence is survival," she said. "Survival without dignity is just another form of death. Stand up even when your knees shake, even when your voice trembles. Because when you stand, you give others permission to stand too." The crowd erupted not with casual applause, but with the kind of thunder that comes from recognizing truth. Parents wept, students raised their fists, and Alicia felt, for the first time, the ripple of her choice reaching shores she would never see. Later that evening, alone again in her apartment, she sat by the window as the city pulsed below. The phone buzzed endlessly, messages from leaders, activists, strangers, but she let it rest. She looked out at the skyline, the same city that had once felt indifferent, now humming with the echo of her words. She understood then that change was not instant nor guaranteed, but she also understood something deeper. Dignity, once demanded, could not be taken back. That knowledge was her peace. She closed her eyes, breathing in the silence, not as a burden, but as a gift. Flight 227 had ended, but its legacy had only begun. The story was not hers alone anymore. It belonged to every voice that refused to bow to arrogance, to every passenger who would board a plane tomorrow and sit taller because she had chosen to resist. The end was not the end. It was a beginning carved from courage. The end. If this story kept you on the edge, I want you to take a moment and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Tell me in the comments what you think about how the plot unfolded. Did Alicia's calm strength inspire you? Did the twists catch you off guard? And what part of her stand against injustice struck you the most? I also want to know where in the world you're watching this from, because stories like this connect us across every distance. Your support and your thoughts keep these powerful stories alive. So share them, discuss them, and let me know what you want to see told next.